With the release of the Mark II version, the Octatrack received a firmware update that brought the new trigger conditions feature to the already powerful Octatrack sequencer. There are some very cool types of trigger conditions, and in particular, I appreciate the introduction of the fill condition, offering a nice variation to the already existing one-shot trigger approach. However, long before trigger conditions ever came to the Octatrack, it has been possible to create a wide variety of probabilistic and conditional triggers through the clever application of simple LFOs. After we explore a few ways to emulate probabilistic and conditional behavior without using trigger conditions, we will also discuss why you may still want to utilize this technique even though trigger conditions are readily available. We can get a rather fine degree of probability using this method. It is tedious, but possible to easily achieve probability increments as fine as 1.5625% or 1/64th, which would allow achieving particular probability percentages that are not in the trigger conditions table, which does not have equal steps between all values. However, for the sake of clarity and brevity, we'll implement it without that level of precision. The first thing we need to do is prepare a sample. First, I'll set up a flex machine to play back slices. Now I'm going to pick a one-shot sample to work with. This one shouldn't be too annoying. The simplest and most straightforward application of this technique is with a one-shot. We are going to resample the one-shot to add a bunch of silence to the end. We'll do 16 steps of recording, then we're going to slice the sample evenly. Setting up my record source, track 1, and I'm also going to change the length. So we need to put down a record trig, and just because I'm occasionally anal retentive, I'll deselect the other input sources. Okay, make sure I have a playback trig, and then I'll go back in the recording setup menu to get ready to remove my record trig. Now we have our one shot resampled with 16 steps of silence. I'll take that record buffer and assign it to my flex machine. So let's take a look at our sample. And we're going to be slicing it into 16 slices. This waveform's kind of quiet, so just for visual clarity, I'm going to normalize that first slice. Normally, I do not normalize any samples, ever. Now I will duplicate the slices, so half of the slices contain one-shots and half are silence. There are a lot of ways you can choose to prepare your samples for this technique to achieve different results, but this is a good basic template to achieve the effect we're going for with probabilistic trigs. 8 slices with identical one-shots and 8 slices of silence. Now I'll throw a bunch of triggers down and adjust the start point of the sample so it plays the first silent slice, slice 9. Go to the LFO setup now and route an LFO to control the start point of the sample. Speed it all the way up and set it to hold and the random waveform. We now get a new random value every trigger. Turn the depth up, and there we go. Let's take a closer look. As you can see here in the waveform display, we appear to be picking randomly between one slice with silence and one with a one-shot. So if my maths are correct, we're getting 50% probability. Don't forget the Octatrack LFOs are bipolar, so now by adjusting the depth of the LFO and the starting slice of the flex machine, we can change the slice selection window and thus change the probability of landing on a silent slice. Here's a lower probability. Here's a higher probability. We can also p-lock the LFO parameters to turn off trigger skipping for particular triggers, or give individual probability values to particular triggers. I'll p-lock the starting slice and the LFO depth on these particular triggers to prevent them from being silenced. Now I'll add some randomness. And I need to go back and change the depths. By changing around the machine's default starting slice, as well as default LFO depth, I can change around the probabilities on the non-p-locked triggers. So now that we've explored how we can use LFO-controlled slice selection to create probabilistic trigger conditions, we'll look at the other main category of possibilities with this technique that I would refer to broadly as phase interference patterns, which allows us to produce an interesting type of non-probabilistic trigger silencing behavior. First, we will look at the possibilities of using a simple square LFO. By changing the speed and phase, we can achieve different masking patterns of our trigger source. Precisely emulating certain trigger conditions may not always be possible with this technique, but it also produces patterns that could not be produced with trigger conditions. If we begin to utilize the custom LFO, we can drill deeper into the possibilities and also gain more control. This begins to turn the Octatrack into a rhythmic sequencer with very modular characteristics for pattern creation and evolution. So why is this still useful when we have trigger conditions available? First, by having one LFO for phase interference and another LFO for probabilistic trig deletion, and using p-locks, we can mix and match the different types of triggers in our pattern, and even combine these two types of triggers. In a sense, something simply not possible with standard trigger conditions. We can also layer these LFO-derived trigger conditions with actual trigger conditions, allowing us to add probability or phase interference to triggers that already have fill conditions, for example. Second, we can use other LFOs on the track to modulate the slice selection LFO and starting slice. In essence, this lets us modulate trigger conditions, changing them dynamically over time. Third, since we have now created an abstracted notion of trigger conditions that is controlled by LFOs and the starting slice parameter, we now have access to modulation of trigger conditions with the crossfader. Finally, I believe this ability to dynamically control the internal state and properties of the trigger conditions makes this technique incredibly worthy of exploration despite the limitations. Also, even if you think it's a worthless kludge, I believe that implementing these trigger conditions for yourself is an excellent exercise that may spark some inspiration in other directions. Happy octatracking!